Hey guys, have you ever wondered what Egypt looked like a million years ago? Today we're going to explore its fascinating history, step by step, all the way to the present. So, get comfortable, dim your lights, and start dreaming with me as we travel through time. Imagine the Nile flowing gently, ancient temples rising from the sands, and the stories of countless generations coming alive around you. If you enjoy this journey, please give the video a like. Leave a comment if you genuinely enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe. It truly encourages me to bring more amazing stories to life. Now, let's dive in and let history whisper to you.
Long before the pyramids rose against the desert sky, before pharaohs ruled and scribes carved their symbols into stone, the land of Egypt carried a story far older than kings. Nearly 1 million years ago, this land was home to some of the earliest humans. They were not yet farmers or builders, but hunters and gatherers, leaving behind stone tools scattered along river valleys. These silent tools tell us that Egypt's story began not with monuments, but with survival. The world they lived in was not the endless desert we picture today. The Sahara was once green, filled with rivers, lakes, and roaming animals, elephants, giraffes, even hippopotamuses. And at the center of it all was the Nile, flowing northward as it still does. It was already the lifeline of the land, offering water, fish, and fertile banks. Early humans followed its rhythm, learning its patterns long before they knew how deeply it would shape their destiny. Over the ages, the climate shifted. Wet periods turned Egypt into grassland. Dry ages pushed the desert forward. Through each change, people adapted, moving, hunting, and shaping better tools. By about 300,000 years ago, modern humans had arrived. They lit fires, they hunted in groups, and slowly, they began to share knowledge through speech. Even then, the seeds of culture were being planted. Around 10,000 BCE, after countless generations, life in Egypt began to change. The Sahara grew harsher, but along the Nile, people discovered something powerful. The river's floods returned each year, leaving behind rich black soil. Instead of wandering, some groups began to stay. They planted wheat and barley, tamed animals, and built the first small villages. The Nile rewarded patience, and people began to trust it. By 6000 BCE, these villages were thriving. People stored grain in clay jars, made pottery, and buried their dead with care, leaving behind ornaments and tools. They began carving boats on rocks, symbols of journeys across the river, and perhaps into the spirit world. The Nile was no longer just water, it was becoming sacred. By 4000 BCE, Egypt was no longer a land of scattered families. Communities were spreading along the river, trading goods, sharing traditions, and preparing for something greater. The people had learned to read the Nile, to depend on it, and to build their lives around its rhythm. The desert on either side hemmed them in, but instead of trapping them, it protected them. Focusing their world around the river's eternal flow, Egypt stood at the edge of a new dawn. From hunters and wanderers, the people had become farmers and villagers. Beliefs were forming, leaders were rising, and the land itself seemed ready to step into history's light. Soon, villages would become kingdoms, and Egypt would move from prehistory into the age of civilization. By 4000 BCE, the scattered farming villages along the Nile had begun to grow into something larger. People no longer lived only as small groups, tending fields and fishing the river. They began to gather in organized communities, bound by shared traditions and the powerful rhythm of the Nile. With each harvest, with each cycle of flood and retreat, their connection to the river deepened. The Nile was more than survival now. It was the giver of wealth, the measure of time, and the path that tied village to village. These settlements evolved into small chiefdoms. Leaders emerged, not just as protectors, but as figures of authority who organized labor, managed surplus grain, and conducted trade. In Upper Egypt, where the Nile cut through narrow valleys, strong local rulers developed. In Lower Egypt, the wide delta allowed communities to expand in different ways, trading with the Mediterranean and beyond. Slowly, Egypt became divided into two distinct regions, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. Competition between these regions was inevitable. Along the Nile, each community sought to control trade routes, fertile land, and the respect of neighbors. But rivalry also brought innovation. Pottery became more refined, art more symbolic, and burial practices more elaborate. In these early graves, filled with goods for the afterlife, we see the beginning of a belief system that would define Egypt for thousands of years. The idea that death was not an end, but a passage. As generations passed, the small chiefdoms united under stronger rulers. Around 3100 BCE, one king from Upper Egypt rose above all others. Some call him Narmer, others Menes, but his legacy is clear. He became the first to unify Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom. On an ancient stone artifact, the Narmer palette, we see him wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, a symbol of unity, a statement that two lands had become one. This unification was not just political, it was cultural. The people now shared gods, traditions, and a vision of order. Egypt had stepped firmly into history. The Nile Valley, once dotted with independent villages, was now a kingdom ruled by a single pharaoh, a leader believed to stand between gods and men. With this union, Egypt's destiny, as one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, began to unfold. From this moment onward, Egypt would rise into an age of temples, writing, and colossal monuments. The pharaohs of the First Dynasty set the foundations of centralized power, and the people began to build not only for survival, but for eternity. The unification was the spark, but what followed would become fire. Egypt was ready to enter its first great age, a period we now call the Old Kingdom, when kings would raise monuments that still stand today, and the desert would echo with the voices of gods and men. With the unification of Egypt complete, the stage was set for the first golden chapter of Egyptian history. Around 2700 BCE, the Old Kingdom began, and with it rose the image of Egypt that still catches the imagination of the world, the pyramids. But before stone giants pierced the desert sky, Egypt was shaped by something deeper, the belief that the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a divine being, chosen by the gods to keep balance on earth. The Nile provided order, flooding each year to renew the soil. The pharaoh embodied that same principle of order, known as Ma'at, the balance between chaos and harmony. To maintain this balance, the pharaoh directed not only the affairs of the kingdom, but also vast projects that demanded the hands of thousands. The first great step toward immortality came with King Joseph, who reigned around 2650 BCE. Guided by his brilliant architect Imhotep, he commissioned a monument unlike any before, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. Rising in tiers of stone, it was not just a tomb, but a statement. For the first time, stone replaced mud brick, and architecture reached for the heavens. The Step Pyramid stood as a ladder to eternity, a symbol that the pharaoh was destined to join the gods after death. This innovation inspired generations. Soon, kings of the Fourth Dynasty sought to outdo one another. It was during this time that the greatest pyramids were built. Sneferu, the master builder, experimented with shapes, giving us the bent pyramid and the red pyramid, each a step closer to perfection. His son, Khufu, would achieve what no one had before, the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid, constructed around 2560 BCE, remains one of the most extraordinary human achievements. Built with over 2 million stone blocks, some weighing more than 50 tons, it has stood for more than 4,000 years, defying time. Around it rose the smaller pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure, and the guardian of the plateau, the Great Sphinx, its lion's body and human face watching over eternity. These monuments were not mere tombs. They were eternal machines for the soul, designed to secure the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. To build them required organization on a scale the world had never seen. Farmers, freed from fields during the flood season, joined armies of workers, engineers, and craftsmen, all fed and supported by the kingdom's resources. Far from the myth of slaves dragging stones under whips, evidence shows these builders were skilled laborers who took pride in serving their god-king. The Old Kingdom was not only an age of stone, it was also the birth of Egypt's art, literature, and administration. Scribes developed hieroglyphs into a sophisticated writing system, recording prayers, laws, and myths. Statues and reliefs captured the faces of kings and queens, priests and workers, freezing them forever in poses of dignity. Yet beneath the glory, challenges stirred. Building such colossal monuments strained the kingdom's wealth. Droughts and political struggles would eventually test the strength of Maat itself. The Old Kingdom reached dazzling heights, but as every monument casts a shadow, Egypt too was moving toward a time of uncertainty. And so, as the pyramids stood tall against the desert sun, cracks began to form in the kingdom's order, leading Egypt into its first great age of decline, the first intermediate period. The pyramids of Giza stood untouched against the sky, eternal monuments of Egypt's greatness. Yet behind their grandeur, the Old Kingdom was slowly unraveling. By around 2200 BCE, the divine order of Ma'at began to falter. Droughts weakened the Nile's floods, harvests failed, and with famine came unrest. A kingdom that had seemed eternal slipped into crisis. This era, known as the First Intermediate Period, was a time of division. The pharaoh's power collapsed, and Egypt fractured into competing regions. Local governors, called nomarchs, gained strength, ruling their provinces like independent kings. They built their own tombs, raised their own armies, and often ignored the weakened central authority. The once united land of Egypt had splintered into rival territories. Despite the chaos, this period was not only about decline, it was also a time of creativity and resilience. Ordinary Egyptians, for the first time, left behind their voices in writings and prayers. Laments and poems from this era tell of hunger, injustice, and longing for unity. It was a reminder that history was not only the story of kings, but also of the people who tilled the fields, prayed to the gods, and endured hardship. Eventually, from the south in Thebes, a new line of rulers began to rise. Determined to restore Egypt's unity, they waged battles against rival lords and extended their influence northward. After decades of conflict, Egypt was once more brought under a single rule. This reunification marked the beginning of a new age, the Middle Kingdom, around 2050 BCE. The Middle Kingdom was a rebirth. Pharaohs like Mentuhotep II, who first reunited the land, and his successors built a stronger, more centralized state. Learning from the failures of the Old Kingdom, these rulers shared power more carefully, balancing the needs of local governors with the demands of the crown. They encouraged farming, improved irrigation, and restored confidence in the Nile's blessings. Art and literature flourished again, but with a new tone, less rigid, more human. Statues of pharaohs from this period show them not only as mighty gods, but also as weary men, carrying the burdens of rule. Stories like the tale of the shipwrecked sailor and the story of Sinuhe reveal a society that valued wisdom, resilience, and the adventures of ordinary people. The Middle Kingdom was a rebirth. Pharaohs like Mentuhotep II, who first reunited the land, and his successors built a stronger, more centralized state. Learning from the failures of the Old Kingdom, these rulers shared power more carefully, balancing the needs of local governors with the demands of the crown. They encouraged farming, improved irrigation, and restored confidence in the Nile's blessings. Art and literature flourished again, but with a new tone, less rigid, more human. Statues of pharaohs from this period show them not only as mighty gods, but also as weary men, carrying the burdens of rule. Stories like the tale of the shipwrecked sailor and the story of Sinuhe reveal a society that valued wisdom, resilience, and the adventures of ordinary people. The Middle Kingdom also expanded Egypt's horizons. Pharaohs sent armies south into Nubia, securing gold mines and trade routes. Expeditions traveled to distant lands, bringing back exotic goods and new ideas. Temples rose to honor the gods, and pyramids were built once more, though smaller than those of Giza, more practical, yet still tied to eternity. For nearly 4 centuries, the Middle Kingdom gave Egypt stability and pride. But as always in history, strength invited challenge. To the north and east, new peoples watched Egypt's wealth with hungry eyes. From the deserts beyond the delta, they would soon arrive, not as traders, but as conquerors. And so, while the Middle Kingdom shone with a quiet, steady light, a shadow was already gathering at its edges, preparing to plunge Egypt into another era of struggle. The time of the Hyksos invasion. The Middle Kingdom had brought stability, prosperity, and renewed pride to Egypt. Farmers thrived along the Nile, artisans filled temples with art, and pharaohs ruled with authority balanced by wisdom. But as history often shows, no golden age lasts forever. Around 1650 BCE, a new challenge emerged from the northeast deserts, people who would change Egypt in ways no one could have imagined: the Hyksos. The Hyksos were foreigners, likely from the Levant, who migrated gradually into the eastern Nile Delta. Unlike earlier nomadic groups, they brought with them new weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and unfamiliar tactics of war. For Egypt, this was unprecedented. The existing armies, skilled in traditional methods, were suddenly outmatched by the mobility and firepower of the newcomers. By exploiting internal divisions among the Egyptian provinces, the Hyksos slowly gained power. They established control over the delta, ruling as kings in the northern lands, while southern Egypt remained under native rulers. This period, known as the Second Intermediate Period, saw Egypt divided once more. The Hyksos adopted many aspects of Egyptian culture. They worshipped Egyptian gods, built cities in the Nile Delta, and even used Egyptian hieroglyphs. But they remained outsiders, a constant reminder that the kingdom was no longer unified under native rule. For the people of southern Egypt, this era was challenging, but also transformative. They learned from the Hyksos, adopting new technologies such as composite bows, improved fortifications, and the chariot itself. While foreign occupation was unwelcome, it sparked innovations that would later empower Egypt to reclaim its unity. Life continued along the Nile. Farmers tilled their fields, fishermen cast nets into the river, and craftsmen carved stone and wood. The Nile's rhythm persisted, indifferent to who ruled its banks. Yet, beneath the surface, a new sense of Egyptian identity began to solidify. Stories of resilience and the divine destiny of native rulers spread, keeping the hope alive that Egypt would rise again. After nearly a century under Hyksos influence, southern rulers from Thebes began to push back. Among them was Ahmose I, a determined and ambitious leader who launched campaigns to expel the Hyksos from northern Egypt. Through careful strategy and relentless effort, he succeeded, reunifying Egypt for the first time in centuries. This victory marked the end of the Second Intermediate Period and the dawn of the New Kingdom, an era that would define Egypt's greatest power and glory. With the Hyksos gone, Egypt stood taller than ever. The lessons learned during their occupation, the use of new military technologies, fortified cities, and strategic planning, strengthened the pharaoh's rule. They had survived foreign domination, adapted, and emerged stronger, ready to expand their influence far beyond the Nile Valley. And so, as the armies of Thebes marched northward and Egypt was once more united, a new chapter was beginning. The Nile, the deserts, and the mountains bore witness to a land that had endured countless trials. Now it was ready to become the empire of pharaohs, the civilization that would build temples that reached the sky and conquer lands as far as Syria and Nubia. The stage was set for the new kingdom, the age of Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramses, the era when Egypt would shine as the most powerful state of the ancient world. With the Hyksos expelled and Egypt reunified, the Nile Valley entered its most glorious era, the New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE. This was a period of unparalleled power, wealth, and ambition. Pharaohs now ruled not just as kings, but as god-kings, wielding authority that stretched from the Mediterranean in the north to Nubia in the south. The memory of division and foreign invasion had left its mark, and the rulers of this era were determined to ensure Egypt's security and dominance for centuries to come. Among the first to shape this empire was Ahmose I, the very king who expelled the Hyksos. He rebuilt Egypt's army, strengthened fortifications, and secured the borders. Trade flourished, linking Egypt with distant lands like Byblos, Crete, and Punt, bringing timber, spices, and precious metals. Artisans thrived, crafting jewelry, statues, and intricate wall reliefs that celebrated both gods and kings. Temples became centers not only of worship, but also of wealth, knowledge, and administration. As the new kingdom progressed, pharaohs such as Thutmose III turned Egypt into a military powerhouse. Thutmose, known as the Napoleon of Egypt, led campaigns deep into Nubia and the Levant. Cities were conquered, trade routes controlled, and tributes flowed back to the Nile Valley. Egypt's influence stretched farther than ever before, and the pharaoh's authority seemed limitless. Yet, it was not conquest alone that defined this age. It was also culture, religion, and monumental architecture. Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, exemplified this blend of power and innovation. She commissioned grand temples at Deir el-Bahari, oversaw trade expeditions to Punt, and promoted monumental art that celebrated her divine role. Her reign showed that Egypt's greatness depended not only on armies, but on vision, diplomacy, and cultural leadership. Religion continued to shape every aspect of life. Pharaohs were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Massive temples were built at Karnak and Luxor, adorned with colossal statues, intricate hieroglyphs, and towering obelisks. The Nile remained central. Its floods symbolized the god Hapi's blessing, and the river's predictable rhythm underpinned both agriculture and governance. The new kingdom also brought advancements in warfare. Chariots, refined bows, and disciplined armies allowed Egypt to dominate its neighbors. Yet, the Nile's life-giving waters remained the backbone of this power. Without the river's bounty, the grandeur of the new kingdom would have been impossible. The pharaohs depended on its fertility as much as they did on their armies. This era produced some of Egypt's most famous rulers, including Akhenaten, who introduced radical religious changes, and Ramses II, whose reign saw monumental construction, diplomatic treaties, and legendary battles like Kadesh. Temples, statues, and inscriptions from their time communicate not just power, but the ambition to be remembered for eternity. Despite their achievements, the new kingdom was not eternal. External pressures, internal unrest, and the slow erosion of centralized power would eventually challenge Egypt's dominance. Yet during this age, the civilization reached its zenith. Its armies, temples, art, and influence cast a shadow that would be felt for millennia. And so, as the pharaohs rode chariots along the desert sands and caravans moved along the Nile, Egypt had transformed into an empire. Its people, from farmers to priests to artisans, were part of a civilization that combined strength, culture, and divine authority. But even the mightiest empires faced challenges. The years ahead would bring shifts, invasions, and foreign rulers, setting the stage for Egypt's later struggles and eventual encounters with new powers across the Mediterranean and beyond. The new kingdom had brought Egypt to the peak of power, wealth, and influence. Pharaohs ruled as living gods, temples soared toward the sky, and armies conquered lands far beyond the Nile Valley. Yet even the mightiest civilizations are not immune to time, and by the late 12th century BCE, Egypt began to face a series of challenges that would slowly erode the stability of its empire. External pressures loomed large across the eastern Mediterranean. New peoples, known collectively as the Sea Peoples, began to move, raiding coastal cities and disrupting trade networks. These invaders, skilled in maritime warfare, threatened the very lifelines that had allowed Egypt to flourish. Meanwhile, neighboring states in Canaan and Nubia, once subdued by Thutmose III and Ramses II, began to assert independence. Tribute and resources that had once flowed into Egypt dwindled, leaving the empire financially strained. Within Egypt itself, the strains of empire began to show. Pharaohs no longer held uncontested authority over distant provinces. Regional governors gained influence. Local unrest increased, and succession disputes sometimes weakened central control. Temples, once symbols of divine order, became powerful centers of economic and political influence, occasionally challenging the pharaoh's supremacy. Even the Nile, which had always been Egypt's constant, seemed less predictable in this period, as minor droughts and fluctuations affected agriculture and food supply. Ramses III, one of the last strong rulers of the new kingdom, fought valiantly to repel the Sea Peoples. Monumental battles chronicled on temple walls depict fierce fighting and the king's personal valor. Though Egypt survived these invasions, the cost was immense. Resources were depleted, armies were stretched thin, and the economy suffered. Within a few generations, the new kingdom had lost much of its cohesion, leaving Egypt vulnerable to internal decay and external pressures alike. Despite the decline, Egyptian culture continued to flourish in pockets. Art, literature, and religious traditions persisted, even in times of political instability. Temples remained centers of learning and worship, and scribes continued to record the deeds of kings, the cycles of the Nile, and the myths of gods. The Egyptian people, resilient and enduring, maintained their identity even as political power waned. By around 1070 BCE, the new kingdom had largely come to an end. Egypt entered a period historians call the Third Intermediate Period, characterized by political fragmentation, rival dynasties, and shifting capitals. For centuries, the land of the pharaohs would experience cycles of division and reunification, with native rulers contending against Libyan, Nubian, and later foreign influences. Yet the lessons of the new kingdom endured. The monuments, temples, and texts created during this golden age preserved knowledge, faith, and artistry that would inspire future generations. Egypt's civilization, had proven its ability to rise, adapt, and survive despite the changing tides of history. And so, as the last great pharaohs of the New Kingdom faded from power and the Nile flowed past their crumbling monuments, Egypt prepared to face a new chapter. The land, resilient and eternal, would continue to endure invasions, foreign rule, and internal change, setting the stage for the rise of Nubian kings, Libyan dynasties, and eventually the Greek and Roman periods. As the New Kingdom faded into memory, Egypt entered a period of fragmentation and uncertainty. Around 1070 BCE, the once mighty pharaohs of Thebes no longer commanded the full Nile Valley. Power was divided among multiple rulers, each asserting authority over different regions. The centralized control that had defined Egypt's earlier greatness weakened, and local leaders, or nomarchs, increasingly acted as independent kings. This era, known as the Third Intermediate Period, was a time of both political instability and cultural adaptation. In the north, the Nile Delta became home to dynasties of Libyan origin. These Libyan rulers, descendants of migrants who had settled in Egypt generations earlier, gradually integrated into Egyptian society. They adopted Egyptian customs, worshipped traditional gods, and took Egyptian names, yet their foreign roots gave them distinct perspectives and practices. Through this blending of cultures, Egypt learned to adapt, preserving its identity while embracing diversity. Meanwhile, to the south, powerful Nubian kingdoms were rising along the Nile in what is now Sudan. The Nubians had long interacted with Egypt through trade, warfare, and diplomacy, and by the 8th century BCE, the kingdom of Kush emerged as a formidable power. These Nubian kings were ambitious and capable, and their eyes turned towards the rich lands of Egypt. They would soon conquer the southern regions and ultimately unify the country under their rule, forming the 25th dynasty. During this period, Egypt was a patchwork of authority. Priests in Thebes controlled temple wealth and influenced politics. Libyan rulers dominated the delta, and Nubian kings looked southward, planning their ascent. Even amidst division, Egyptian culture remained vibrant. Art continued to flourish, though it became more regionalized. Temples still honored the gods. Literature recorded the lives of kings and the deeds of heroes. And craftsmen maintained the skills that had built monuments for millennia. This era also demonstrated Egypt's resilience. Despite fragmentation, the Nile continued to sustain life. Farmers tilled the fertile banks. Fishermen harvested the river's bounty, and trade persisted along the waterway. Egypt's economy, though less centralized, endured. Even in times of political uncertainty, the civilization adapted, preserving its language, religion, and artistic traditions. And so, as Nubian pharaohs ruled from Thebes and Libyan dynasties lingered in the delta, Egypt prepared for the next transformative era. The arrival of new empires would challenge its sovereignty. But the civilization's essence, its culture, religion, and identity would survive, bridging the ancient past with the wider Mediterranean world. The rise of the Nubian dynasty had briefly restored Egypt's unity and pride, but the world beyond the Nile Valley was shifting. Far to the northeast, new empires were rising, empires that would bring with them armies unlike anything Egypt had faced before. The first of these great foreign powers to challenge Egypt's independence were the Assyrians, a fierce military state from Mesopotamia. The Assyrians were relentless conquerors, masters of iron weaponry, siege engines, and disciplined armies. Their kings ruled through fear and authority, extending their empire across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and eventually toward Egypt. Around the 7th century BCE, their ambitions collided with the Nile. Egypt, under Nubian rule, sought to resist, But the Assyrians marched with overwhelming force. Cities were burned, palaces looted, and the once mighty land of the pharaohs was humbled. For the first time in centuries, Egypt found itself under the shadow of a foreign empire, its rulers no longer entirely in control of their destiny. Though the Assyrians did not hold Egypt for long, their invasions revealed how vulnerable the kingdom had become. Power shifted between native dynasties and foreign-backed rulers, leaving Egypt fractured and unstable. Soon, another great power rose in the east, the Persian Empire, under the leadership of Cyrus the Great and his successors. Unlike the Assyrians, the Persians ruled with a blend of strength and tolerance, allowing conquered peoples to maintain much of their culture and religion, as long as they acknowledged Persian authority and paid tribute. In 525 BCE, under Cambyses II, the Persians invaded Egypt and defeated the pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. The once proud land of temples and pyramids became a province of the vast Achaemenid Persian Empire. Persian satraps, or governors, ruled Egypt, and although Egyptian traditions were respected to some extent, the sense of independence was gone. For the first time in its long history, Egypt was no longer a sovereign power, but part of a greater imperial system. Yet still, resentment simmered. Egyptian revolts flared at times, fueled by the desire for freedom and the memory of glorious pharaohs of the past. Though most of these uprisings were crushed, they kept alive the dream of independence. The Persians, powerful as they were, could never extinguish Egypt's identity. This era of Persian rule marked a turning point. Egypt, once the unrivaled empire of the Nile, had become a province in the chessboard of larger empires. Yet change was not over. Across the Aegean Sea, a new power was rising, a young conqueror whose ambitions. By the 4th century BCE, Egypt had endured centuries of foreign domination. The Persians had come and gone, leaving their mark on the land, but the people of the Nile remained deeply rooted in their traditions. Then, in 332 BCE, a new figure arrived whose ambitions would reshape Egypt forever: Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian king whose conquests stretched from Greece to India. Alexander's arrival was remarkably bloodless. The Persian satraps in Egypt, recognizing the unstoppable power of his army, offered little resistance. The people of Egypt welcomed him as a liberator, grateful to see the Persians replaced by a ruler who allowed them to maintain their customs and religion. In the city of Memphis, Alexander was hailed as a pharaoh, bridging the old traditions with his new rule. Yet, Alexander did not linger long. Instead, he laid the foundations for a city that would become a symbol of Egypt's new era, Alexandria, on the Mediterranean coast. This city was designed to be a hub of trade, learning, and cultural exchange, a place where Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and merchants from across the known world could meet and thrive. Alexandria would become the heart of Egypt under the coming dynasty, a symbol of Egypt's transformation into a multicultural empire. After Alexander's untimely death in 323 BCE, his vast empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted companions. Ptolemy declared himself pharaoh and established the Ptolemaic Dynasty, which would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. Unlike previous foreign rulers, the Ptolemies embraced Egyptian traditions. They presented themselves as pharaohs, worshipped Egyptian gods, and built temples to honor the deities, while also maintaining their Hellenistic heritage. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a center of learning and culture. Alexandria flourished, with its Library of Alexandria housing countless scrolls and knowledge from across the ancient world. Scholars, mathematicians, and astronomers traveled there, creating a golden age of intellectual achievement. Egyptian religion and Greek thought coexisted, merging in art, architecture, and daily life. Temples retained their grandeur, but new theaters, palaces, and marketplaces reflected the cosmopolitan nature of this era. Economically, Egypt thrived. The Nile continued to nourish crops, and Alexandria became a key trading port, connecting the Mediterranean to Africa and the Near East. The Ptolemies maintained a strong army and a naval fleet, ensuring the kingdom's security against rivals and pirates. Yet, the dynasty also faced challenges: internal rivalries, succession disputes, and the delicate balance between Greek and Egyptian populations created ongoing tension. Despite these challenges, the Ptolemaic era left an indelible mark on Egypt. It was a period of fusion. Egyptian tradition blended with Hellenistic culture, creating a unique identity that would influence the region for centuries. From this time emerged some of Egypt's most famous figures, including Cleopatra VII, whose life and reign would become legendary. As the Ptolemaic dynasty advanced, Egypt approached a new crossroads. Its independence, though carefully maintained by skilled rulers, would eventually face the expanding power of Rome, signaling the next chapter in the long, extraordinary story of the Nile. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt under the Ptolemies had become a world of splendor and tension. Alexandria shone as a center of knowledge, culture, and trade. But behind the glittering streets and grand temples, the dynasty struggled with internal rivalry and the ever-growing shadow of Rome. Among the rulers of this era, none would leave a mark as enduring as Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra ascended the throne in 51 BCE, during a time of political instability. Co-ruling with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, she quickly proved herself a skilled leader, navigating the complex balance between Egyptian tradition and Hellenistic influence. Her intelligence, charisma, and mastery of languages enabled her to communicate not only with her people, but also with the powerful leaders of the Mediterranean world. Rome, expanding across the Mediterranean, was both a threat and an opportunity. Cleopatra allied herself strategically with Julius Caesar, whose military victories and political influence stabilized her position on the throne. Following Caesar's assassination, she aligned with Mark Antony, forging a partnership that combined political ambition with personal devotion. Together, they sought to preserve Egypt's independence against the rising might of Rome. But the fate of Egypt was increasingly intertwined with Roman politics. The alliance with Antony provoked conflict with Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. In 31 BCE, the decisive Battle of Actium changed everything. Cleopatra and Antony were defeated, and their deaths marked the end of Ptolemaic rule. Egypt, once the independent heart of a great civilization, became a province of the Roman Empire. Under Roman rule, Egypt retained much of its culture and economy, but the pharaohs were gone, replaced by governors reporting to Rome. Alexandria remained a thriving city of trade, learning, and cultural fusion, yet its role shifted. It became part of an imperial network rather than the independent capital of a sovereign nation. The Nile continued to sustain life, as it had for millennia, providing fertile fields, abundant fish, and transportation routes. Life along its banks persisted, but the era of native kings shaping Egypt's destiny had ended. Despite the loss of independence, the legacy of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies endured. Egyptian religion, art, and architecture continued under Roman oversight. Temples were maintained, rituals observed, and monuments preserved. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture persisted, influencing art, philosophy, and religion for centuries to come. Egypt's absorption into Rome marked a profound transformation. The civilization that had survived millennia of invasions, dynastic struggles, and foreign rulers now entered a period where its identity was preserved within a larger empire. The Nile, the eternal lifeline, remained the thread connecting past and present, ensuring that Egypt's story would continue, even under foreign dominion. And so, as Cleopatra's reign ended and Roman legions patrolled the Nile, Egypt transitioned into a new era. Its ancient kingdoms were memories etched into stone and sand, but the civilization itself would survive, influencing the Mediterranean world and leaving an indelible mark on history. The stage was set for centuries of Roman rule, Byzantine influence, and later Islamic conquest, each adding layers to Egypt's extraordinary story. With Cleopatra gone and Egypt annexed by Rome in 30 BCE, the Nile Valley entered a new chapter under imperial authority. Egypt became a vital province of the Roman Empire, prized for its fertile fields, grain production, and strategic location. Rome relied on Egypt to feed its growing population, and the province was tightly controlled by governors appointed by the emperor, often with harsh oversight to prevent rebellion. Despite foreign rule, daily life along the Nile continued much as it had for millennia. Farmers plowed the rich black soil left by the annual floods. Fishermen cast their nets into the river, and artisans shaped pottery, jewelry, and statuary. Temples remained active centers of religious and social life. Egyptians continued to worship traditional gods such as Amun, Isis, and Osiris, and festivals celebrating the cycles of the Nile persisted, blending ancient traditions with Roman influence. Alexandria flourished as the cultural and economic heart of Roman Egypt. Its harbor welcomed merchants from across the Mediterranean, while scholars in its famed Library of Alexandria pursued knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The city became a hub where Greek, Egyptian, and Roman culture merged, producing a cosmopolitan society that was both vibrant and resilient. Under Roman rule, Egypt experienced both stability and hardship. The province was heavily taxed to supply Rome with grain, and local elites were integrated into imperial administration. Roman military garrisons patrolled the Nile, ensuring loyalty and suppressing uprisings. Yet the Egyptians preserved their own customs, blending them with Roman governance. Temples continued to be built or renovated, often with inscriptions honoring both Egyptian gods and Roman emperors. By the 4th century CE, Egypt became part of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Roman rule. Christianity spread rapidly throughout the Nile Valley, transforming the religious landscape. Ancient temples gradually gave way to churches, and monasteries emerged in the desert, attracting monks seeking solitude and spiritual devotion. The Coptic language, derived from Egyptian, began to flourish as a written script for Christian texts, preserving Egypt's linguistic heritage even as the religious focus shifted. Despite these changes, the Nile remained central to Egyptian life. Its predictable floods continued to nurture crops, sustain towns, and connect communities. Egyptian identity persisted through language, art, and customs, even as rulers changed and religions evolved. The land's resilience and the people's connection to the river allowed the civilization to endure centuries of foreign dominion. However, the Byzantine period also exposed Egypt to external threats. The empire faced challenges from invading armies, internal power struggles, and economic pressure. These vulnerabilities would ultimately pave the way for a transformative new era, the arrival of Islam in the 7th century CE, which would redefine Egypt's political, cultural, and religious landscape forever. And so, as Roman and Byzantine governors managed cities along the Nile, and Christian monks settled in desert monasteries, Egypt's story continued. The land of pharaohs had adapted once more, blending its ancient heritage with new traditions, preparing to enter a chapter that would link the Nile's timeless flow with the rise of the Islamic world. By the early 7th century CE, Egypt had been under Byzantine rule for centuries. Its ancient temples and thriving Nile cities bore witness to millennia of history. Yet the region was vulnerable to the sweeping changes transforming the wider Middle East. The rise of Islam brought a new force that would forever alter Egypt's political, cultural, and religious identity. In 639 CE, an Arab army led by Amr ibn al-As crossed into Egypt, moving swiftly along the Nile. The Byzantine governors, weakened by internal conflict and the pressures of empire, were unable to resist effectively. Within a few years, Egypt had fallen to the Muslim conquerors. Alexandria, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, surrendered peacefully, marking the end of Byzantine control and the beginning of Islamic rule. The Arabs established Fustat, near modern Cairo, as the new administrative center. Here, they built mosques, palaces, and marketplaces, integrating Islamic governance with the enduring rhythms of the Nile. The population, composed of native Egyptians, Greeks, and other communities, gradually adopted Islam. Though Christianity remained prominent for centuries, Arabic replaced Greek and Coptic as the administrative language. Yet Coptic survived as the liturgical language of the Egyptian Christian Church. Under Islamic rule, Egypt flourished economically and strategically. The Nile's fertility continued to feed growing populations, while the region became a hub of trade linking Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Cities along the river grew, and new irrigation projects improved agricultural output. Egypt's grain fed not only local populations, but also far-off regions, making the country a critical asset for successive Islamic empires. Culturally, Egypt became a center of learning and religious scholarship. Islamic institutions, schools, and mosques flourished, particularly in Fustat and later in Cairo. The fusion of Egyptian traditions with Islamic governance produced a society that respected the Nile, valued scholarship, and balanced continuity with innovation. Art, architecture, and urban planning evolved, blending local styles with Islamic motifs, minarets rising beside ancient temples, and markets bustling along the riverbanks. Throughout the medieval period, Egypt faced both internal and external challenges. Dynasties rose and fell, from the Umayyads to the Abbasids, and later to regional powers such as the Fatimids. Crusaders occasionally threatened the region, while nomadic tribes and rival rulers tested control over the Nile Valley. Yet the resilience of the land and its people ensured continuity. The Nile's waters continued to flow, sustaining crops, cities, and commerce, providing a lifeline through political upheaval. By the time of the Fatimid Caliphate in the 10th century, Cairo had emerged as a major capital, a city that would dominate Egypt for centuries. It became a center of religion, commerce, and education, reflecting Egypt's long history of adaptation and integration of new cultures. Medieval Egypt was no longer the land of pharaohs, but the Nile remained its heart, tying past and present together, preserving the essence of Egyptian civilization through the centuries. And so, as Islamic rulers built mosques and palaces along the Nile, Egypt entered a new era. The land that had once witnessed pharaohs, Greeks, Romans, and Byzantines now embraced Islamic culture, preparing to face the Mongols, the Crusaders, and later the Ottoman Empire, each leaving a mark on the enduring story of the Nile. By the mid-13th century, Egypt had become a crucial center of the Islamic world. Strategically located at the crossroads of Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. The Fatimid Caliphate's rule had weakened, creating a power vacuum that allowed a new force to rise: the Mamluks, a remarkable military caste composed originally of slave soldiers of Turkic and Circassian origin. Despite their unusual beginnings, The Mamluks seized control of Egypt in 1250 CE and established a dynasty that would rule for over 2 centuries. The Mamluks were extraordinary organizers and warriors. They transformed Egypt into a militarized state, capable of defending its territory against both internal rivals and external threats. Their armies successfully repelled the Mongols, who had devastated much of the Middle East, and drove back the Crusaders, securing Egypt as a dominant regional power. The Nile remained the lifeblood of the land, feeding both the population and the agricultural surplus necessary to maintain such a powerful military. Under Mamluk rule, Egypt experienced a cultural renaissance. Cairo became the empire's capital, a sprawling metropolis of mosques, schools, markets, and palaces. The Mamluks were great patrons of architecture, commissioning grand structures adorned with intricate carvings, domes, and minarets. Al-Mayad Mosque, Sultan Hassan Mosque, and other landmarks still stand today as testimonies to their skill and vision. Scholars, artisans, and merchants flocked to Cairo, turning the city into a vibrant center of Islamic learning, science, and trade. Trade flourished along the Nile and beyond. Egypt's strategic location made it a hub for caravans from Africa, Europe, and Asia. Goods such as gold, spices, textiles, and grain flowed along the river and across the deserts, linking Egypt to distant civilizations. The Mamluks regulated trade carefully, ensuring wealth remained concentrated in Cairo and major Nile cities, while also funding their armies and monumental building projects. Daily life in medieval Egypt revolved around the Nile. Farmers tilled the fertile floodplains, fishermen harvested its waters, and craftsmen shaped pottery, textiles, and metalwork. Markets bustled with merchants and travelers, blending cultures and ideas. Religious life continued to thrive, with mosques serving as centers for worship, education, and social interaction. The Mamluks maintained the traditional respect for the river while enhancing urban infrastructure, building bridges, canals, and fortifications along its banks. Despite the dynasty's power, challenges persisted. Succession disputes, rebellions, and occasional famine tested the Mamluk state. Yet their ability to adapt, combined with the Nile's unchanging generosity, allowed Egypt to remain a dominant force in the region. The civilization that had endured pharaohs, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and early Islamic rulers now flourished under the disciplined and ambitious Mamluk elite. And so, as Cairo's minarets pierced the sky and Nile boats carried goods and people along its timeless waters, Egypt entered the late medieval era. The land had once again demonstrated its resilience, blending military might, economic power, and cultural brilliance. Ahead lay the final chapters of medieval Egypt, culminating in the arrival of a new empire from the east, the Ottomans, whose influence would reshape the land once more and set the stage for Egypt's modern history. By the early 16th century, Egypt had endured centuries of dynastic change, foreign invasions, and remarkable cultural achievements. The Mamluks, once the unrivaled military rulers of the Nile Valley, had established a powerful state, but new forces were rising in the wider world. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire, led by Sultan Selim I, launched a decisive campaign into Egypt, defeating the Mamluk sultans and annexing the region into one of the largest empires in history. The Ottoman conquest marked a significant transformation. Egypt became a province of the empire, governed by a pasha appointed by Istanbul, though local Mamluk elites retained influence for decades. The Ottomans recognized the importance of Egypt's fertile Nile and its strategic location, controlling trade routes between Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Cairo and Alexandria became administrative and commercial hubs, linking local life to the broader Ottoman network. Under Ottoman rule, the Nile continued to dictate daily life. Farmers relied on the annual floods to nourish crops, while merchants transported goods along the river and through desert trade routes. Cotton, grain, and spices became central to Egypt's economy, supporting both local populations and the imperial coffers in Istanbul. Cities thrived, bustling with markets, artisans, and scholars, blending Ottoman architectural styles with Egypt's own rich cultural heritage. The Ottomans allowed a degree of autonomy to local leaders, particularly former Mamluk elites, creating a complex power structure. While pashas collected taxes and enforced imperial authority, Mamluk families retained social and military influence, occasionally challenging Ottoman governors. This delicate balance of power sometimes led to tension, yet it also helped Egypt maintain stability, preserving traditions while integrating into the wider empire. Culturally, Egypt under Ottoman rule remained vibrant. Mosques, madrasas, and caravanserais were built or renovated, showcasing the fusion of Ottoman and Egyptian architectural styles. Islamic scholarship flourished, and Egyptian religious practices blended local traditions with Ottoman influence. Despite political subordination, the people of the Nile continued to celebrate festivals, worship gods and saints, and maintain their connection to the river that had shaped their civilization for millennia. Trade and international connections also expanded. Egyptian ports facilitated commerce with Europe, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Cairo remained a bustling center of administration and culture, while Alexandria became a gateway for goods, ideas, and travelers from distant lands. The Ottomans valued Egypt not only for its strategic location, but also for its ability to sustain agricultural and economic wealth that fueled the empire. Yet challenges persisted. Corruption, taxation, and occasional revolts tested Ottoman authority. The empire's attention often focused elsewhere, leaving Egypt to navigate local governance largely on its own. Still, the Nile endured as Egypt's lifeline, its annual floods sustaining agriculture, settlements, and trade, allowing civilization to persist despite political changes. As the 18th century approached, Egypt faced new currents of change. Local leaders sought greater autonomy. European powers eyed the region with increasing interest, and the stage was set for a remarkable figure to emerge, Muhammad Ali Pasha, whose reforms would redefine Egypt's modern identity. By the early 19th century, Egypt remained under Ottoman sovereignty, yet the empire's distant control allowed local leaders to exercise considerable autonomy. Amid this backdrop emerged one of Egypt's most transformative figures, Muhammad Ali Pasha, an ambitious Albanian officer who would shape the modern identity of the Nile Valley. Rising to power in 1805, Muhammad Ali sought not merely to rule Egypt, but to transform it into a regional power capable of challenging both Ottoman and European influence. Muhammad Ali's vision for Egypt was revolutionary. He recognized that military strength, economic development, and education were essential to building a modern state. He reorganized the army, introducing European training methods, modern weaponry, and disciplined regiments drawn from local populations and conscripted peasants. This new military not only secured his authority within Egypt, but also allowed him to project power into neighboring territories, including Sudan and the Levant. Agriculture became another focus. The fertile lands along the Nile, long Egypt's lifeblood, were carefully cultivated to increase production. Muhammad Ali promoted cash crops, such as cotton, which became central to both Egypt's economy and its trade with Europe. He built irrigation systems, canals, and infrastructure to maximize the Nile's potential, ensuring that the river continued to sustain the country even as demands on its resources intensified. Education and industry were equally important. Schools, military academies, and technical institutions were established to train a new generation of administrators, engineers, and scholars. factories and workshops produced textiles, weapons, and other goods, fostering a sense of self-reliance and modernization. Muhammad Ali understood that Egypt's survival depended on knowledge as much as on military might. Culturally, his reforms blended tradition with innovation. While he respected Egypt's heritage and the centrality of the Nile to daily life, he also encouraged European methods and ideas, creating a hybrid society capable of engaging with the wider world. Cities like Cairo expanded with new streets, government buildings, and urban planning, reflecting the ambitions of a modern state. Muhammad Ali's foreign ambitions were equally bold. He sent military expeditions into Sudan, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant, challenging Ottoman authority and expanding Egypt's influence. Although he ultimately recognized the limits imposed by European powers, his campaigns demonstrated the potential of a modernized Egypt to play a significant role on the regional stage. By the mid-19th century, Muhammad Ali had transformed Egypt from a provincial territory into a semi-independent, modern state with a strong army, a thriving economy, and a vision for the future. Yet, his successors faced the challenges of maintaining these reforms, balancing European pressures, and managing the timeless rhythms of the Nile that had sustained Egypt through millennia. As the Nile continued to flow past the canals, farms, and bustling streets of Cairo, Egypt stood poised at the threshold of the modern era. The reforms of Muhammad Ali Pasha ensured that the country was no longer merely a relic of the past. It had become a dynamic state, blending ancient traditions with new systems, prepared to navigate the political and economic currents of the 19th and 20th centuries. By the late 19th century, Egypt had become a semi-independent state under the descendants of Muhammad Ali Pasha. But its strategic location and wealth made it a target for European powers. The construction of the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, transformed Egypt into a vital artery connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and beyond. While the canal promised trade and prosperity, it also attracted foreign interest, particularly from Britain and France, who saw the Nile and the canal as keys to imperial dominance in the region. Financial difficulties in Egypt, caused by ambitious modernization projects and the heavy cost of administration, left the country vulnerable. European powers gradually gained control over the economy, controlling banks, trade, and debt management. This foreign interference fueled resentment among Egyptians, who saw their nation's independence slipping away despite centuries of resilience and adaptation. By 1882, tensions erupted into conflict. A nationalist uprising, led by Egyptian officers and civilians, sought to reclaim sovereignty and reduce European influence. However, British forces intervened, citing the protection of the Suez Canal and European interests. Egypt was effectively placed under British occupation, though officially still part of the Ottoman Empire. British control reshaped politics, infrastructure, and governance, leaving the Egyptians under a new foreign authority. Despite occupation, Egyptians resisted. Nationalist movements began to take shape, emphasizing education, media, and political organization as tools of resistance. Figures such as Saad Zaghloul and the Wafd Party became symbols of the struggle for independence. Students, intellectuals, and workers rallied for reforms, challenging both colonial policies and the limitations imposed by foreign control. The Nile remained central to these efforts, not only as Egypt's lifeblood, but also as a symbol of identity and continuity, linking generations who had survived pharaohs, foreign invaders, and dynasties. Economic and social life adapted under British rule. Railways and ports were expanded, urban centers grew, and the administration implemented new systems for taxation and governance. While some modern infrastructure benefited Egyptians, colonial control also reinforced inequalities, favoring British interests over local needs. Rural communities along the Nile continued their agricultural traditions, but national pride and the desire for self-determination simmered beneath the surface. By the early 20th century, the movement for independence gained momentum. World War I and subsequent global shifts weakened European colonial authority, providing Egyptians with new opportunities. In 1922, Egypt was formally recognized as an independent kingdom under King Fuad I, though British influence remained significant. The decades that followed were marked by political struggle, social change, and cultural revival, as Egypt balanced modernization with the enduring traditions of its Nile-centered sea. As the 20th century unfolded, Egypt faced the challenges of asserting full sovereignty, managing urban growth, and integrating modern institutions while preserving its rich heritage. The Nile, eternal and sustaining, remained at the center of this journey, a witness to centuries of conquest, renewal, and resistance. The story of Egypt was far from over. It was evolving once again, ready to enter the era of modern nationhood and global significance. By the mid-20th century, Egypt had endured centuries of foreign influence, dynastic change, and struggle for sovereignty. The British occupation had left deep marks, but the desire for full independence and national identity had grown stronger. In 1952, a group of young officers, known as the Free Officers Movement, orchestrated a coup that ended the monarchy and led to the establishment of the Republic of Egypt. This new era promised modernization, national pride, and a reinvigorated connection to the Nile, the timeless heart of the nation. One of the most transformative leaders of this period was Gamal Abdel Nasser, who emerged in the 1950s as the symbol of Arab nationalism and Egyptian sovereignty. Nasser's vision extended beyond politics. He sought economic modernization, land reform, and infrastructure development, emphasizing the Nile as the central resource for Egypt's growth. The Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, became a monumental achievement of this era, controlling the river's floods, generating electricity, and expanding agricultural land. The Nile, once relied upon solely for traditional farming, became the engine of industrial and national development. Urbanization reshaped Egypt as well. Cities such as Cairo and Alexandria expanded rapidly, drawing people from rural Nile communities seeking education, employment, and modern amenities. Education and literacy programs transformed society, blending ancient traditions with contemporary knowledge. Yet, even amidst modernization, the Nile's rhythm remained central to daily life. Farmers continued to depend on its waters, cities grew along its banks, and the river's annual cycles influenced agriculture, culture, and the national psyche. Modern Egypt also faced challenges. Population growth, environmental pressures, and regional conflicts tested the country's capacity to manage its resources. The Nile, a river that had sustained civilizations for millennia, became the focus of careful planning and international negotiation. Egypt's relationship with upstream nations, particularly Ethiopia and Sudan, required delicate diplomacy to ensure that water from the river, the lifeline of Egyptian civilization, remained sufficient for agriculture, drinking, and industry. Culturally, Egypt embraced its long history while integrating modern influences. Ancient monuments, temples, and pyramids continued to inspire both Egyptians and visitors from around the world. At the same time, modern architecture, universities, theaters, and media reflected the country's evolving identity. The fusion of the ancient and contemporary created a society rooted in history, yet reaching toward the future. Through revolutions, reforms, and modernization, the Nile remained the enduring symbol of continuity. From the earliest pharaohs to modern engineers and farmers, The river linked generations, shaping Egypt's identity, economy, and culture. As the Republic of Egypt advanced, the Nile continued to carry not just water, but the story of a civilization that had survived millennia of change. And so, by the late 20th century, Egypt had firmly entered the modern era. Its cities buzzed with life, its fields flourished, and its people looked toward progress while honoring the timeless river that had nurtured them for thousands of years. The story of Egypt was no longer just about kings and conquerors. It was about a nation navigating the complexities of modernity, still guided by the ever-flowing Nile. Entering the 21st century, Egypt stands as a nation shaped by millennia of history, yet facing the complex challenges of modernity. Urban expansion, population growth, and environmental pressures test the country's ability to manage its resources, particularly the ever-vital Nile, which remains central to Egypt's identity, economy, and survival. The river continues to sustain agriculture, industry, and urban life, but balancing these demands in a rapidly growing nation requires innovation, diplomacy, and resilience. Modern Egypt grapples with social and economic challenges. Rapid urbanization has transformed Cairo into a sprawling metropolis, blending historic districts with modern skyscrapers, highways, and industries. Cities such as Alexandria and Luxor have become hubs for commerce, tourism, and culture. Yet, rural communities along the Nile still depend on traditional farming, and disparities in wealth, education, and opportunity highlight ongoing challenges. The government, local authorities, and civil society work continuously to address these issues while maintaining the delicate balance between modernization and tradition. The Nile remains at the center of environmental and political concerns. Climate change, upstream dam projects, and water management disputes require careful planning and international diplomacy. Egypt's survival depends on securing the river's flow, sustaining fertile farmland, and ensuring sufficient drinking water for its growing population. Projects such as modern irrigation systems, water conservation programs, and regional agreements aim to preserve the Nile's bounty, echoing the centuries-long reliance on this life-giving river. Culturally, Egypt continues to draw strength from its heritage. Ancient monuments, pyramids, temples, and tombs attract scholars, tourists, and filmmakers, connecting modern Egypt to its extraordinary past. Meanwhile, contemporary literature, art, music, and cinema reflect a dynamic society engaged with global trends while remaining rooted in its unique history. Egyptians navigate the modern world with an enduring sense of identity, shaped by the Pharaohs, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, and countless other influences that have flowed through the Nile Valley over millennia. Education and technology have become pillars of resilience. Schools, universities, and research centers cultivate innovation, scientific advancement, and cultural preservation. Young Egyptians are increasingly participating in shaping the nation's future, blending traditional knowledge with modern expertise. The Nile, as always, continues to inspire love, creativity, and a profound connection to history. Political and social developments further demonstrate Egypt's resilience. Movements for reform, debates about governance, and efforts to balance tradition with modernity illustrate a society constantly negotiating its past and future. Egyptians continue to draw strength from their heritage, honoring the legacy of ancient civilizations while actively engaging with the challenges of the present. And so, as the Nile flows past the bustling streets of Cairo, the historic temples of Luxor, and the fertile fields of Upper Egypt, the nation moves forward. Contemporary Egypt faces challenges, yet its people remain rooted in a civilization that has endured for millennia. The river, ever flowing, reminds all that life persists, culture endures, and the story of Egypt is far from finished. As the 21st century unfolds, Egypt stands as a testament to endurance, adaptation, and continuity. Its modern cities hum with life. Its rural communities still rely on the timeless fertility of the Nile, and its people carry forward a rich tapestry of history stretching back thousands of years. From the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom to the leaders of the contemporary republic, Egypt has been shaped by countless rulers, invaders, and innovators. Yet its identity remains anchored by the Nile and the cultural memory embedded in its landscapes. Egypt faces numerous contemporary challenges: rapid population growth, urbanization, environmental pressures, and the complexities of modern governance. Yet these challenges are met with a sense of resilience and innovation. Egyptians are building infrastructure, developing education systems, and engaging with global networks of trade, science, and culture. The country balances its ancient traditions with the necessities of modernization, showing a capacity to evolve while maintaining its unique heritage. Culturally, Egypt continues to inspire the world. Archaeological discoveries uncover layers of history previously unknown, connecting people today with civilizations that built the pyramids, sculpted temples, and chronicled their lives on papyrus. Egyptian art, music, literature, and cinema flourish alongside these ancient relics, demonstrating the enduring creativity of its people. Tourism, education, and research draw global attention, reminding the world that Egypt is not only a place of historical fascination, but a living, evolving society. Reflecting on Egypt's history reveals a civilization defined by adaptation and continuity. It has survived foreign invasions, dynastic collapses, colonial occupations, and modern challenges, yet it has never lost its identity. The Nile has been the constant thread weaving together this vast tapestry of human endeavor, sustaining life, culture, and civilization through millennia. From the earliest settlements along its banks to the modern republic, Egypt's story is one of remarkable endurance, innovation, and vision. As Egypt moves forward, it does so with an awareness of its past and a commitment to its future. The pyramids, temples, mosques, and modern cities stand as symbols of continuity, while the Nile flows unceasingly, nourishing the land and its people. This river, eternal and life-giving, is the heart of Egypt, linking past, present, and future in a story that spans over 10,000 years. And so, the story of Egypt continues. It is a civilization that has survived the rise and fall of empires, the passage of centuries, and the challenges of modernity. Yet it remains vibrant and resilient. The Nile flows as it always has, and Egypt endures, a living bridge between the ancient past and the unfolding present, a nation whose story continues to inspire the world.